Dialogue or confrontation? In today's world, disputes over maritime boundaries and territorial sovereignty remain widespread. The United Nations Charter encourages all member states to resolve their differences using peaceful means such as negotiations or consultations, but in practice, it's not always the case. It's often not the case. Why is that? Why some countries prefer to refer to the book of confrontation instead of that of dialogue? What are the consequences of confrontational approaches when it comes to the seas that are connecting us in East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth? And what can we do? How can we sail together smoothly across the whirlpool of security dilemma that threaten to engulf us all? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part one of a special two-part series on settlement of maritime disputes, dialogue or confrontation. We are here in the beautiful seaside resort of Sanya in southern China's Hainan province. The program is jointly organized by the Huayang Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, the China Oceanic Development Foundation, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies of China, Hainan Institute for Free Trade Port Studies, and CGTN. I'm Lu Xin. It's indeed a great honor. And I'm even more honored to have 7 distinguished panelists sitting next to me. Let me introduce them to you. Starting from my immediate left, Wu Shicun, Chairman of Huayang Research Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance and Chairman of the Academic Committee at China's National Institute for South China Sea Studies. Welcome, Mr. Wu. Philip Saunders, Dean Emeritus and Adjunct Professor of Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University in Canada. O.A. Sun, Principal Advisor at the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia. Welcome. Navy Captain Suk Jun Yoon, Senior Fellow at the Korea Institute for Military Affairs and a retired Navy Captain of the Republic of Korea Navy. Welcome. Yan Yan, Director of the Research Center for Oceans Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. Welcome. Romel Banlawi, President of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies. Good to have you on the show. And last but not least, Ambassador Yi Shen Liang, Visiting Professor at Chengdu University of Technology and former Ambassador of China to Norway. And we're also pleased to have all of you on site. Let's give ourselves a warm round of applause. So during part one of this program, we'll hear from each speaker to make an opening statement on their take, on their thoughts and suggestions concerning how do we promote dialogue and avoid confrontation in trying to settle disputes in the waters connecting us. Let's start with Mr. Wu Shicun, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Liu Xin. I will strictly follow your requirement, manage well the time. Actually, I'm going to focus my talking on the South China Sea issue and then how to promote cooperation between China and United States in the South China Sea region. Then how to look at the current South China Sea situation, I would like to summarize that as 3 aspects. One, generally speaking, South China Sea now is relatively stable and manageable, but if we don't manage well, there will be big challenges. Where and how? One is the intensified militarization spearheaded by the United States, followed by U.S. allies and partners in this region. If we look at the bilateral or trilateral or multilateral security mechanisms in the South China region or beyond, all of those are targeted or designed for China. Second one is unilateral actions in the South China region by United States. If we look at unilateral oil and gas exploitation in disputed area, land expansion or land reclamation, or try to consolidate their control over the islands or reefs, you might agree with my judgment. unilateralism is another challenge. The third one is detrimental impact of the 2016 arbitration ruling. All those unilateral actions conducted by climate states, majority of those activities are endorsed by the arbitration ruling. So in this sense, the arbitration ruling, or the award of tribunal, is the troublemaker of peace and stability of the South China Sea, and the troublemaker of the bilateral relations, China and the Philippines, and then how to promote maritime cooperation between China and the countries in this region, particularly between China and the Columbia states. Very short remarks. China and the littoral countries in the South China region, particularly the Columbia states, should promote our maritime cooperation under the DOC. What DOC says? Under the framework of DOC, environmental protection, marine scientific research, search and rescue in the South China region, and the safety of the maritime navigation. So those areas are possible for China and Columbia to promote cooperation. We should start from small, bilateral, long-term initiatives. For instance, joint fishery survey in the South China region. Is it possible? It's possible because it is less sensitive, it's easy to start, and it's easy to bring benefits to all participants. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wu. Thank you. And thank you very much for respecting the time limit. I was really fascinated about what you were saying, unilateralism as the main source of problem. For instance, 2016 ruling by the so-called arbitral tribunal in The Hague, and where can we start to build trust? But let's move on to our next speaker before we expand on these points. Professor Philip Saunders, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to preface these quite brief remarks by acknowledging an important limitation. I'm going to speak not so much to the South China Sea dispute, which is part of this, but to that notion of a subset of dispute settlement, which is adjudication, binding adjudication, whether in a court or tribunal, whether entirely ad hoc or through some process defined in prior agreements, such as the Law of the Sea Convention. These may be compulsory, but even then, they are through an advance consent, and international law works that way. States consent to be adjudicated. We don't get that benefit in domestic law. But they may consent through the treaties in advance, but on conditions that they feel will protect their interests over time. So the ones that are most problematic are what I might call contested compulsory jurisdiction, like South China Sea arbitration, where an arbitral or other tribunal proceeds under an advance consent, but one party believes that it is not operating within its proper jurisdiction. Now, it's obvious to most, and fortunately our host has taken away about 3 seconds of the time I need on the UN Charter and its dispute resolution options. But it's important to remember that there are much broader dispute settlement options that operate every day. The minority of dispute settlement occurs through adjudication. Peaceful means, including negotiation, including as simple as an agreement to disagree. Now, my hometown in Canada is a few kilometers away from a remaining boundary and sovereignty dispute we have with the United States of America, an island in which we have disagreed over the ownership since the American Revolution. We're right. The problem with that is not a problem. We just continue the disagreement. We've been on the same side in most conflicts since. That is an agreement to disagree, and we manage to dispute. But to say that not all dispute settlement is by adjudication would add to that one important qualification. Not all adjudications are dispute settlement. The adjudication doesn't necessarily constitute the settlement of a dispute for a number of reasons. Resources and management, resources and territorial disputes and the relationships that they involve have to be managed both before and after a tribunal reaches a decision on the part of a dispute that is within its jurisdiction to settle. It's very rare that a tribunal could actually settle by judicial decree all of the aspects of a dispute. So that implies that the decision to litigate is a policy choice. What aspects of the dispute have been identified as resoluble by adjudication, and where binding adjudication is unlikely to deliver a settlement to the underlying dispute, as I think was the case to some degree in the South China Sea arbitration, then seeking compulsory procedures should be considered confrontation by other means, not necessarily dispute settlement as such.
Thank you so much. Very interesting points, the keywords, advanced consent, for instance, an agreement to disagree between US and Canada, and ambitious tribunals. Maybe we get to these points later. Mr. O, from the Southeast Asian regional countries' perspective.
Well, of course, I think nowadays most of us would prefer dialogue instead of confrontation in terms of settlement or disagreements over maritime or territorial disputes. But I think from the Southeast Asian perspective, I would venture to propose that typically among Southeast Asian countries, we have a very established, shall we say, model for settlement or at least dialogues on these sort of disputes. Typically, we will start with whenever there's a territorial or maritime dispute, the participants, the various disputing countries, they will have let's say a round of arguments, sometimes very public arguments, voicing out their concerns, their positions, and so on. And very often that is, of course, for domestic consumption, for domestic political advantages, and so on. But that is important because then you sort of, in a sense, release the valve a little bit and not accumulate a lot of tensions, emotional tensions, which could later on jeopardize the bilateral relations. So after this, typically a few weeks of sort of venting and voicing out your positions and so on, typically the senior officials or the senior politicians of these disputing countries, they would perhaps meet up, they would sit down to, well, engage in dialogues, engage in negotiations, or in general engage in talks. And then later on, after such dialogues, typically there will be one of three outcomes. Number one, it would be, for example, well, they do reach some bilateral agreements or settlements. Number two, sometimes if we cannot reach bilateral agreements, then we submit for international, well, adjudication or, well, sometimes arbitration. And then if we still cannot reach such outcomes, then, well, we will set aside for further considerations in the future until such disputes occur again. So this process, I think, maintain the harmony and sometimes even, as I said, profitability among all the ASEAN countries or Southeast Asian countries. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. But both Malaysia and Indonesia agreed when they went to court over those issues, right? Navy Captain Yoon, it's your time for the opening statement.
Thank you, moderator. The topic I would like to discuss is military neutrality between naval operation and the law enforcement. Because military activity in the disputed waters, especially in South China Sea, is one of intractable issues to mitigating dialogue rather than to enhancing more physical confrontations. Contentions over the disputed water in East Asia must be understood with two important distinct paradigms, legal and military. In order to preserve a balance between these two, military neutrality should be established. so that the naval operations and law enforcement do not result in physical confrontation. To mitigate such conflict, the naval experts love to suggest the notion of military neutrality, which emphasizes the importance of avoiding the militarization of law enforcement operations. I would like to suggest some benefit of this for the parties, not to mention third parties. The first, military neutrality provides dispute parties and also third parties with a framework of fully considered political, operational, and diplomatic implication of using kinetic means. Second, military neutrality implies commitment to seek a good, reasonable resolution of a dispute and agreed not to involve or extend use of naval and law enforcement. Third, and most importantly, military neutrality mandates the on-scene commander, operational command, from refrain from use kinetic weapons in disputed waters, where their legality is quite unclear. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Navy Captain Yoon. Thank you. So the central message is very clear, military neutralization. We'll talk more about that during the second part of the program. Next, let's move on to Ms. Yan Yan, your opening statement.
Thank you,
Please.
Chair. Today I want to address three pairs of relations. The first one about the relationship between global order and maritime order, and the second relationship is about maritime dispute settlement and maritime cooperation, and the final relationship about between exclusive maritime interests and inclusive maritime interests. Well, first of all, about global order. The global order that China supports is actually the international system with the UN at its core, and also the international order based on international law, and the basic norms of international relations based on the UN Charter. In terms of the ocean, from Hugo Grotius' Mare Liberum to John Staton's Mare Clausum, the debate on how to utilize ocean resources and how to, what is the principles and rules should be adhered to in claiming maritime rights has never stopped. To me, maritime order is part of the global order, and therefore we should also support the UN standard and international law-based maritime order. And second, about the relationship between maritime dispute settlement and maritime cooperation. The purpose for maritime cooperation is to build mutual trust and confidence among states, especially among coastal states and claimant states, therefore to contribute to the final settlement of the dispute. However, while the dispute settlement takes time, it is often difficult and sometimes extremely difficult to promote and to enhance maritime cooperation. And the reason is actually very simple, because almost every claimant state wants to maximize its own national interest, maritime national interest. Therefore, currently we see not just the South China Sea, but also the whole world's ocean disputes, the traditional maritime disputes over sovereignty and maritime boundary delimitation still the main key causes of conflict and frictions between the states. And finally, what is the solution and what is our way out? I think this is the question of the relationship between exclusive maritime interests and inclusive maritime interests. From the previous speakers, we did hear many suggestions and many proposals on how we can solve maritime dispute, like through dialogue, through negotiation, and also through legal means, and also the role of military in terms of the dispute. We do hear many proposals. And the settlement of maritime disputes sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades, and sometimes it even takes centuries. So with while the maritime disputes has not been settled for a short time, how we can move on, how we can guarantee the regional peace and stability. To me, it is the question of how we can balance exclusive maritime rights and inclusive maritime rights. Well, my personal argument is that maritime security can be and should be viewed as an inclusive interest given the common interest in combating the verified maritime security threats, for example, piracy, terrorism, environmental damage, etc., etc. And this is why back in the year 2019, China proposed the idea of MCSF, maritime community with a shared future. As I already mentioned in the opening about global order, for maritime order, we also need to adhere to international system with the UN as core and international order based on international law. And also, we need to bear in mind that the ocean is the shared heritage of mankind. Therefore, we need to bear in mind the concept of MCSF. And I think personally, that is our way out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yin Yan. Very breaking out of the box, thinking out of the box, three pairs of relations. Very interesting how to achieve a balance among them, between them. Let's move on to our guest from the Philippines, Ms. Ban Loi, please. Your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Lishin. Mabuhay from the Philippines. I would like to emphasize that confrontation is always counterproductive to regional peace and prosperity, and dialogue is the way ahead for the peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. And so I would like to discuss some pragmatic and legal options for the peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. The 1982 United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea provides many important provisions for coastal states to peacefully settle maritime disputes in order to promote cooperation and avoid violent conflicts at sea. When undertaking unilateral activities in disputed areas, UNCLOS obligates all states to take actions that entail cooperation, consultation, and most importantly, prior notification. And according to UNCLOS, there are at least three types of provisional arrangements in disputed areas. Number one is development cooperation arrangement. Number two, provisional boundary agreement. And three, mutual restraint arrangements. Development cooperation arrangements can be in the form of joint fishery management, common development of hydrocarbon resources, marine environmental research, marine environmental protection, and others. Development cooperation is the primordial goal of the 2002 China-ASEAN Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and even the ongoing negotiation for the conclusion of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Provisional boundary agreement, on the other hand, is viewed to be an alternative option to final maritime delimitation because, as said by Dr. Yan Yan, it will take really time to have this kind of final maritime delimitation agreement. But provisional boundary agreement aims to pursue cooperation or pragmatic cooperation to fulfill the mandate of UNCLOS for all parties to exercise their duty to cooperate, which the DOC and COC aim to achieve. Finally, a mutual restraint arrangement obligates parties to UNCLOS to mutually exercise self-restraint in the conduct of harmful and even offensive unilateral activities that hamper cooperation and even jeopardize the reaching of a final agreement. Coupled with obligation to exercise mutual restraint is the application of the principle of due regard, which requires states to respect the inherent rights and legitimate national positions of other states on maritime issues. We need mutual respect in settling our disputes in the South China Sea. Without self-restraint and due regard, it will be very difficult to promote development cooperation and even come out with a boundary agreement, whether in the final or provisionary forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ban Loi. Thank you. We often forget the UNCLOS encourages certain conduct on top of prohibiting some others. Yeah, thank you for reminding us, and we will dive into that aspect during part 2 of the discussion. Last but not least, Ambassador Yi Xianliang, your turn, please.
Cooperation and governance need two pillars. One is mechanism, and another one is the rule of law. Right now, most of the conflicts and disagreements arise from the semi-enclosed sea globally. While we talk about the ocean governance and cooperation, most problems and conflicts come from the enclosed sea and the semi-enclosed sea. So I would like to have some suggestions for our region, because right now, or nowadays, from Sea of Japan, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, South China Sea, we have no anybody of the coastal states to deal with the issues in a whole picture. First is about the bodies, I mean the mechanism, where we need to have some political decision on the high level. Perhaps we need the council of the heads of states or heads of the governments, and also the committee for the ministers. Then we have some resources committee to deal with fisheries and biodiversity. They said, perhaps we need some bodies for science and technology, for climate change, meteorology, and also we need some environment bodies for oil dig, for microplastic like this. So this is for the mechanism. And they said for the rules, right now we have no rules from the coastal states or between the coastal states. We have a lot of basis for such rules. Treaties, multilateral treaties, bilateral treaties, national laws and practice. So let's try our best in this regard. But what we need now is political determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Yi. Thank you very much. Yeah, so the lack of the void or deficit in governance as a result of the deficit in political trust. Unfortunately, that's so much time we have for part one of this special series, two-part series on dialogue or confrontation in maritime dispute settlement. But we will have a very lively, I believe, discussion during part two. So do look out for us. A warm round of applause for the time being to Mr. Wu Shitun, Professor Philip Saunders, Mr. O.A. Sun, Navy Captain Suk Jong-yu, Ms. Yan Yan, Mr. Romel Balawi, and Ambassador Yi Xian Liang. And with that, we come to the end of part one of this two-part series from Me, The Point with Liu Xin, coming to you from Sanya. It's been co-organized by the Huayang Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, the China Oceanic Development Foundation, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, the Hainan Institute for Free Trade Port Studies, and CGTN. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching for now, and I'll see you in part two.